Hello, everyone. Everyone can hear me. It's a great pleasure to welcome Zhuang Juzhong and all of you here to a very exciting presentation from the Asian Development Bank and this year's Asian Development Outlook. One of the very great benefits of having somebody like you visit us is, of course, that it brings together not only prestigious Norwegian politicians, but also a lot of people who engage in Asia and international economics-related research. My own name is Hans Gåsemyr. I'm a recent addition to the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. I also work at the University of Bergen, specializing on Chinese politics and economy myself, but also, of course, greatly interested in the Asia overall region. We are hosting this together with the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we have State Secretary Tone Skogen with us today, who is one of the most experienced Norwegian state secretaries and also becoming one of the most well-traveled, of course, after moving to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we'll be heading to celebrate the Asian Development Bank's anniversary next week. Is that it? Yeah. But most of all, of course, we're very happy to welcome Zhuang Juzhong, who is the Deputy Chief Economist of the Asian Development Bank, also directing the Department of Research and Regional Cooperation. So a very well-positioned and very well-informed speaker. He has also done a lot of research both recently and in the past himself, has a PhD in economy from the University of Manchester, also worked for several years at LSE, or the London School of Economics and Political Science. So he will present, first introduced introducing and setting the tone for the topic by Tone Skogen, and then our senior economist and head of the International Economy Division here at the Institute, Arne Melchior, has prepared some comments, and then we will join for a Q&A afterwards, all of us. I've been told to say that the event will be streamed, so if you are skeptical about how you will look in the future on the web, I have informed you. That's all the legal obligation I have. We will start with Tone Skogen, who will give a few remarks. And we should also be aware that if the first, we will have a kind of a stage shift after these presentations, and then the State Secretary will have to leave a little before 2 o'clock. But I think the presentation part should be over by that time. All right, so again, very much welcome here and looking forward to a very interesting presentations and discussions. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. And dear Mr. Juzhong, I hope I say that somewhat correctly. And dear ladies and gentlemen and friends. And first, let me start by congratulating the Asian Development Bank on the launch of this year's Asian Development Outlook. And a special thank to you, Mr. Juzhong, for coming all this way to Norway, to Oslo, to present it. The ADB is a long-standing partner for Norway in our endeavors to promote development and inclusive growth in Asia. We are pleased to be working with an institution that is renowned for its efficiency and for its focus on results. As Norway's representative on the bank's Board of Governors, as we heard, I will be attending the annual meeting in Yokohama next week, and I very much look forward to that. As you know, the bank is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, and we will therefore be reviewing 50 years of development in Asia, as well as discussing the challenges ahead. And your presentation here today will set the stage for next week's meeting. Asia is a success story when it comes to development. During the last 50 years, millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. From 1981 to 2013, the percentage of extremely poor people was reduced from over 66% to just 9%. In 1991, more than 90% of the people in Asia still lived in low-income economies. Today, more than 95% live in middle-income countries. But these countries now face a new challenge: how to transition to high-income economies in a sustainable way, which is also the subject of this year's Asian Development Outlook report. We know that in order to move from middle income to high income status, investments in human capital and infrastructure are needed. The ADB is a central source of finance for the Asian region to be able to make these important investments. However, middle-income countries also face another challenge that is just as important: poverty and growing inequality. More than 70% of the world's poorest live in middle-income countries. Poverty reduction is one of the primary objectives of Norway's development policy and the core mandate of the ADB. It is at the heart of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development to leave no one behind. This means we must ensure that growth is sustainable and inclusive. Many middle-income countries are rich in resources. However, a good distributive policy is crucial to achieve inclusive growth. Aid is far less important for development than it used to be. Middle-income countries are expected to finance the lion's share of their developments themselves. Good governance and fair and efficient tax systems are the key to ensuring the necessary revenues. This holds true for all countries. Norway's wealth is in large part due to the systems that we have established to manage our petroleum revenues. Today, we share our experience with other countries through the Oil for Development and Tax for Development programs. A vital element in a good distributive policy is ensuring basic health services and education for all citizens. Education and health are top priorities in Norway's development policy. And we have doubled our funding for education in the last 4 years. Recipient countries should also increase their spending in these areas. In Nepal, for example, the percentage of public expenditure on education has nearly doubled. Between 1990 and 2013, the percentage of children starting school increased from 64% to 95%, and the literacy rate among young people rose to 85%. Access to energy is another precondition for inclusive growth. Today, more than 700 million people in Asia lack access to electricity. Energy demand in the region will almost double by 2030. To remain under the 2-degree threshold of the Paris Agreement, this need has to be met while transitioning to a less carbon-intensive energy mix. The ADB must accompany the individual countries in their efforts to deliver on their nationally determined contributions and build green economies. We are pleased by the bank's ambition to double its climate financing. Investments in energy efficiency and renewable energy sources are necessary. Norway is supporting these investments in close cooperation with the ADB through support to the Central Energy Fund and co-financing at country level. In Bhutan, for example, we have contributed to universal access to electricity through more than 20 years of assistance to develop hydropower in that country. In Nepal, more than 6 million people now have access to electricity, in part due to our support. Nevertheless, Asian countries are still facing daunting challenges. We need to work together to meet them. Leveraging finance from the private sector is key. The private sector provides 9 out of 10 jobs in developing countries and is the main driver of development. We will continue working with the ADB to increase focus on private sector development in Asia. The ADB is extremely well placed for this work. It is not only one of the most important sources of finance in the region, it is also a knowledge bank that provides valuable advice and guidance for the member countries. Today, we will benefit from the bank sharing its knowledge through your presentation, Mr. Jong Zhuang. We look forward very much to hearing you speak on these issues, and thank you for your attention.
I think you just can come on board. Drunk?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was just standing up to give you a glass of water.
All right. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. State Secretary Skogen and distinguished guests, good afternoon. Very pleased to be here again. I think I was here 3 years ago, also on the presentation mission, the ADO, that was 3 years ago. So first of all, I would like to thank Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Norwegian Institute of International Affairs for hosting today's event. And Norway, of course, is an important shareholder of ADB, and we very much appreciate the continued strong support from Norway. Now, what I'm going to present is Asian Development Outlook 2017. The report was just released 2 weeks ago in Hong Kong. We are doing a tour of dissemination. I'm coming here in Europe, and my colleague, Chief Economist Swada, Mrs. Swada is in North America, and then we have a number of dissemination events in the region as well. So probably just a brief introduction to this report. ADO, we call it ADO, is ADB's flagship publication. It comes out twice a year, and it covers basically, it provides assessment of short-term economic outlook and longer-term development challenges for Asia, and it covers 45 ADB's developing member economies. And so this year, the longer-term challenge, the issue we are looking at is how to come over the challenge of middle-income transition. So let me just start with key messages, and then I get to go into some details. So basically, on the short-term outlook part, we see developing Asia, the growth will be solid at 5.7% this year and the next year, slightly down from 5.8% last year. And the region is benefiting from improving economic outlook in advanced countries, mainly the US, Eurozone, and Japan. On the other hand, the China's growth will continue to moderate, although it will be gradually, but will moderate further. So that will offset somewhat the growth, improve the growth outlook for the rest of the region. And the third message is that we all know global commodity price is picking up, oil price is higher now, so that will lift the inflation, the region's inflation, but the inflation rate for developing Asia as a whole will stay below the average of the past 10 years. And then the key risks to this outlook, to this assessment, is mainly from the uncertain policy directions in advanced economies, and mainly in the United States especially. And the key message from the theme chapter, we call theme chapter, is this issue of middle income transition, is that innovation, human capital, and infrastructure that are important to boost the productivity growth of the middle income countries, which are the key to pave the way to high income. So let me just start with these key messages. Now, on the short-term outlook part, as I said, we see the region growth to remain solid, 5.7% this year and the next year. But if we exclude so-called NIEs, the newly industrialized economy, including Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, and maybe China, if we exclude these four economies, so the region's growth will be 6.3% this year and 6.2% next year. So at these rates, developing Asia will remain the fastest growing region in the world, and actually it will contribute to about 60% of the global growth. Global growth this year will be about 3.5%. So developing Asia will contribute to 60% of the global growth. Now, of course, growth performance differ across countries. Actually, we see 30 economies out of 45. I mentioned ADB's 45 developing member economies. So 30 of the 45 will see growth to pick up this year or next year. And then all the sub-region will see growth higher, except East Asia. East Asia, because of the continued growth moderation in China, and growth was slightly lower this year compared to last year. Central Asia will benefit from higher oil prices, and especially Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, the two major economies, will see growth will be higher. And as the higher oil price increase government revenue, and hence more fiscal spending will support growth. Pacific growth will also be higher, and driven largely by largest economy, PNG, Papua New Guinea, where we will see the production in the agriculture sector, and mining will be higher. South Asia growth, again, will also be higher, driven mainly by India, as well as Pakistan. And Southeast Asia, of course, is a very open economy. Most of the economy will benefit from improved external demand, especially the exports. So that is the cross-country kind of performance comparison. Now, this I would say cautiously optimistic assessment is to a large extent, is of course related to the improving outlook in advanced major industrialized economies. So we see the G3, the US, Eurozone, and Japan, the combined growth will be 1.9% this year compared to 1.6% last year. So next year, again, will be 1.9%, and driven mainly by the US pickup from 1.6% last year to 2.4% this year. And as employment, the job market conditions continue to improve. Eurozone, of course, recovery is also evident, and so we slightly reduced the growth compared to last year, and because the uncertainty, because that for instance, relate to the negotiation of Brexit. So that's certainly, but we see growth recovery is evident and unemployment rate has been declining. Japan will also benefit from improved external demand because of the pickup in US and especially in the US. So that's, the improved external environment will support the rebound of exports growth. We know that developing Asia very much depend on export growth as a major, as one of the major growth drivers. So last year and the year before, we can see from the left-hand side chart, export growth for the region as a whole was negative, negative 8% in 2015 and negative 5.3% last year. So this year we will see growth of exports to rebound to 4.7% this year and 3.8% next year. So that is, of course, good news for the region. But you know, not just external demand improving, but domestic demand will remain strong. In the last few years, because of weak external demand, and domestic demand, domestic demand has been a key driver of the region's growth. And this year we will continue this situation to continue. If you can see in this chart, for the major economies in the region, most of the economies here last year growth was entirely driven by domestic demand. The only exception is India, Singapore, and Thailand. So overall, if you look at China, net export growth is negative. So that means demand growth was entirely driven by domestic demand. So we see this continue for the years to come. Now let me just go into some detail into China's growth, being the largest the economy in the region. We see growth moderation will continue. So last year it was 6.7%, and our projection for this year is 6.5%, and the next year will be 6.2%. So China's growth, of course, has been affected by both cyclical factors as well as structural factors. Cyclical factors including, for instance, excess capacity in some of the industries, especially in steel industry. Of course, government is making efforts to work this out. And then in terms of the policy front, government is emphasizing financial sector stability instead of providing larger stimulus to maintain the growth. So in that sense, that of course certainly will affect the growth momentum. And the structural factors are also important. The first is that rebalancing in terms of drivers of growth. China's growth has been growth model has been adjusted towards more reliance on service sector and household domestic consumption, that away from manufacturing, exports, and investment. So that will certainly affect the growth, potential growth. The second is a declining working age population. From 2011, China's the working age population has been on decline. So that again will affect its potential growth. The third is the convergence, the process. As we know that as the country becomes more developed, and the growth rates will come down because you're approaching the frontier. So that the scope for catch-up becomes small, and then growth rate will come down. So that, but overall, we feel the growth. China will be soft landing. We talked about in the past the hard landing, soft landing. So our view is strong. We strongly believe that China will be a soft landing, and growth modulation will be gradual. Now India, the Indian actually growth will pick up this year, and next year from last year was 7.1%, and this year our projection is 7.4%, and next year 7.6%. So at this rate, India will be the fastest growing major economy in the world. And again, there are cyclical factors and structural factors affecting India's growth performance. Cyclical factor, of course, is improved external demand, the same as many other countries. And also another factor is that liquidity squeeze will be easing. The last year we know that India, the experiment replaced the large banknotes with smaller one, so-called demonetization. The effect actually is quite tend to be short-lived, and the impact is temporary. So that, in that sense, growth will continue. And the structural factor is the basic. India introduced quite a number of reforms to improve business climate through deregulation and attract FDI. And also, for instance, introduction of goods and service, national goods and service tax. So, this certainly, the positive impact on the investor confidence and attract FDI. So these are the factors underlying our growth projection for India. Very briefly on inflation. So as I said, inflation will be higher this year and the next year because of the higher global commodity prices. But inflation overall will remain below the region's past 10 years average was about 4%. So that will be lower than the long-term average. And of course, this is a projection on global commodity prices, especially, for instance, in oil price, Brent crude. Last year, the average is $44 per barrel. This year, we're predicting 56, and next year will be 58. So with the higher commodity prices, and inflation will be higher as well. Now, the risk to the outlook. So we see a number of risks, and I just highlight a few. One is the spillover from sharper than expected U.S. monetary tightening. So our baseline assumption is that the U.S. will have interest rate hikes, Fed rate hikes, 3-4 times a year. So each about 25 basis points. And then, of course, if the rate hike is sharper than expected, then that could impact our growth projection. Because if the market is already factored in our baseline assumptions, and if the sharper than expected U.S. rate hikes, that means some Asian central banks will have to respond to raise interest rate in order to avoid the capital outflows, or there are several countries there are higher level of debt, private debt, whether household, companies. That will impact on if it's vulnerable to high interest rates. That's one. The second is the shift in industrialized countries, the trade and tax policies. As I mentioned in the United States, so if the concern, of course, if the policy move towards inward looking, then it can impact on the Asia's export growth. And the third risk that we highlight is the weaker than expected oil price recovery. Now, for developing Asia as a whole, we are net oil importer region, right? So that lower oil price would be good. But on the other hand, there are several countries that very much rely on oil exports, Central Asian countries, and in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, for instance. So that, if lower than expected, could undermine the recovery of the oil and the gas exporters. But overall, we feel the region in a much strong position to manage these short-term risks compared to, for instance, 20 years ago during the period of the Asian financial crisis. So banking sector much stronger, and macroeconomic framework is stronger. So we believe that developing Asia can manage these short-term risks. So that is the first part on short-term outlook. Let me now turn to the longer term. One of the longer term challenges, very important challenges, that so this is about middle income transition challenge. So rapid economic growth in the last 20-30 years has lifted, as the Secretary of State mentioned also in her remarks, lifted most of developing Asian economies to the middle income status. As a result, the proportion of the population live in low income countries in the middle-income countries that increased substantively. In 1991, for instance, only 10% live in middle-income economies. Right? The Asian population lived in middle-income economies, 10%, and 90% was in low-income economies. Now, in 2015, the population in middle-income economies increased to 96%, and population in low-income economy only 1.6%. So that is a very remarkable achievement. Now the question, of course, is that now a largely middle-income region, how Asia can build on its past success and to start the transition to high-income region, high-income economy. So this is the challenge. This is the issue we're talking about. So now we know that a country transitioning from low to middle income, you can rely on labor transfer of rural surplus labor from agricultural sector to modern and service sector, right? And you can rely on labor-intensive technology. But transition from middle to high income, countries have to rely more on productivity growth supported by innovation and industry and production upgrading. So now that is what we understand, and we looked at growth drivers of two groups of countries in the last 50 years. Two groups of countries, growth drivers, and one group is the country started the middle income and they stayed middle income in each decade. And another group is they started with middle income but become high income at the end of before the end of the decade. So with two groups of countries, we look at what are the drivers of growth and what are the differences. And we know that through using growth accounting framework, we can basically divide the growth contribution into four. Growth contributed into four. One is physical capital accumulation. Second is labor accumulation, labor growth. The third is human capital accumulation. And the last is productivity growth. Basically, in economics we call it total factor productivity growth. So you can see that for the country, start middle and stay middle, the contribution from productivity growth is about 10% only. But for the countries, start middle but rise to high, the complete transition, the contribution from productivity growth was close to 30%. So I mean 3 times as higher as for the first group. So now the question, of course, how to boost productivity growth. We have a larger number of empirical studies have a cross-country regression analysis have looked at what are the drivers of productivity growth. Basically, we understand the innovation, human capital accumulation, and the infrastructure has been identified as the important determinants among others, right? So we also in the report we did the same analysis and regression analysis. We confirmed that innovation and human capital accumulation and infrastructure investment are the critical drivers of productivity growth. But to gain insight into the importance of these three areas, innovation, human capital, and infrastructure, in helping countries to complete the transition from middle to high income. So in order to do that, we basically look at, we ask the question, how the countries made the successful transition differ from the countries which did not make the transition in promoting innovation, in accumulating human capital, and in investing in infrastructure. So the two groups of countries, one group made the successful transition, the other one not, and how they are different in innovation, in human capital accumulation, and infrastructure. So first in innovation, these two indicators often used to measure innovation efforts or innovation performance is research development spending. Here is research development stock per labor hour. And another one is resident patent applications per million people. So these are two indicators commonly used. So we can see big difference for the country. For instance, in the case of research and development stock per labor hour, for the countries start in the middle and stay at the middle. The per labor, the R&D stock per labor hour is 0.3 US dollar in 2010 constant price. But for the countries made the successful transition, it was 0.9 US dollar in 2010 constant price. So the second group, research and development stock, is 3 times as high as the first group. And for this story is the same as if you look at the patent application by residents. So for the countries made a successful transition, the patent applications are 4 times as high. For the countries where started with the middle and stayed at the middle. Now, so of course, that innovation is basically driven mainly by entrepreneurs, right? Innovation and by entrepreneurs. And entrepreneurship, we can distinguish 2 types of entrepreneurships. One is the so-called opportunity-driven entrepreneurship. So basically, this opportunity-driven entrepreneurship is responding to new ideas and new technology. Examples, for instance, Uber or Airbnb, right? This kind of new ideas. And the other one is necessity-driven entrepreneurs, basically responding to the existing market demand. For instance, you set up a hotel business or set up a taxi company. So these are traditional. So basically, as the country becomes more advanced, the opportunity-driven entrepreneurship will become more important relative to the necessity-driven entrepreneurship. So we have data from the global survey of entrepreneurship. And we found that this will calculate the ratio of opportunity-driven and necessity-driven entrepreneurship. This ratio, we found that for high-income countries, this ratio on average is 3.4. For middle-income countries, the average is 1.8. So for high-income countries, the ratio is almost twice as high as middle-income. That means in order to complete transition to high income, really the innovation is important. So let me skip, since Mark is looking at me, so let me skip the slide. Okay, so second area I want to talk about human capital. I mentioned human capital, right? Again, here there are big difference between high income, middle income, low income in terms of human capital accumulation. So here we look at total year of the schooling between high, middle, and low income. So for high-income countries, the average is almost 10 years, total years of schooling. And the middle income is 6 years, and low income is 3 years. So that is important. Then the difference between high, middle, and low is even greater if you want to look at tertiary education. Tertiary education, high income is, average year schooling is 0.57. Middle income is 0.2, and low income is 0.05. So the big difference in terms of tertiary education. Now, this, of course, years of education is based on quantity of education. For human capital, we found, actually, we had a study several years ago, the quality of education is even more important. The quality of education, so the question is how we measure quality of education. Now we use this globally standardized test, this PISA test that's managed by OECD. So you can see that this is the results of 2015. We can see big difference between the middle income and the OECD average, right? So for instance, the proportion of low performance in middle income countries in the case of science is almost 50%. And for the middle income, for OECD, it's a low proportion of low performance is 21%. So, big difference. And the low performer is basically have a level below 2. That is defined. For the top performers, there's 5 or above, 5 or 6. So for OECD, it's 7.7% proportion of the top performers, and for middle income, it's only less than 2%. So the story seems more or less the same as mathematics. So basically, we're talking about quality education here measured by test of the 15 years old students, right? So the ability to read, to write, to solve problems. So even you have education, but if you don't have a good quality, then it's still not good enough. So in our report, I mentioned that we highlighted the importance, not just of financing, not just the fiscal public spending on education, but education governance and the management system are very important in making sure that you have a good quality education. So the last issue is infrastructure. The successful economy we found, the successful economies invest a lot in infrastructure always. And here we look at the countries start at the middle, stay at the middle. Countries start at the middle and rise to high income. So in case of electricity generation capacity per capita. So you can see the second group, successful transition economy, the complete transition, the per capita electricity generation capacity is twice as high as the countries start at the middle and stay at the middle. So internet users the same, the difference even greater. So now last 2 months ago, we just released a report on developing Asia's infrastructure investment needs. The region has invested quite a lot actually in infrastructure, but the gap both in terms of quantity and quality remain big. So here that result is from that report. So we looked at, of course, asking the number. Our number is for the developing Asia as a whole. The investment needs for the next 10 years annually is $1.7 trillion US, 1.7 US. So the annual needs 1.7 trillion for the next 10 years. But here we look at a smaller set of the countries, 25 countries with good data. This 25 countries with the period 2016 and 2020, currently the investment is $881 billion, and the needs for this 25 is 1.3 trillion. So we're talking about the gap of almost $500 billion. That is the gap we're talking about. Basically the conclusion from this theme chapter is that attaining high income is challenging. We can see from 50 years experience of developing countries, many countries start in middle, remain middle income, especially for instance many Latin American countries, right? But on the other hand, it is not impossible because we have success story in Asia, Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, and China. So that means it's challenging but possible. The question is, the key is that we have to change the pattern of growth. Growth model have to rely more on innovation, human capital accumulation, and infrastructure. At the same time, we need a good policy and good governance, right? So make sure that this will work toward a higher growth outlook, and then we should maintain the macroeconomic stability. This is also indispensable. So here are the key messages since I already started the explain, so I will not repeat again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Economist Zhuang. And some of us have to leave into the sun or into the rain to attend other affairs. Arne Melchior, our senior economist, will give some prepared comments. And the reason I kept looking at you was not to make it short, but to be sure that we have time to discuss with you some of those very interesting findings.
Thank you.
Oh, the microphone works? Okay. So thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I need some water too.
Water is good.
Yeah, thanks for a very interesting presentation. I will comment mainly on the middle income challenge part of it. On the outlook part, I will not say very much, except that this First, of course, it's very important to recall the importance of Asia for global growth. And that continues to take place. And Asia is still containing a lot of countries at different income levels. So even if Asia reaches the average world income level, it will still contribute significantly to global growth and be very important for the global economy. And in some debates in the West, I mean, the expected decline of growth rates in China from 10 to 6 and perhaps even lower levels in the long run, it's kind of sometimes depicted as a kind of a catastrophe. But of course, 6% is still significant, and this was all expected. So still Asia and China will contribute to global growth. So I think the report is a very useful contribution, and these kind of overall assessments, comprehensive assessments of growth are very good to make regularly. So I'll focus mainly on the middle income part, and I think it's a very useful overview of key issues related to the middle income challenge. It concludes by surveying the literature that it's uncertain whether there is actually a trap or not. So this is not fully conclusive, but of course it's the case that some countries, some emerging economies were able to rise to high income levels, others not. So there is a lot of new evidence analysis in the report, and I think the key messages make sense. It focuses very much on productivity and innovation, with implications for education, infrastructure, R&D policies, competition policies, allowing entry, etc., innovation, human capital accumulation and the quality of education, infrastructure from transport, which is key in the lower income economies, to more advanced infrastructure, for example, on the internet, which is more important when countries move up the ladder. So I'll comment on some of these issues and a couple of those that are not there, because of course you cannot write about everything every time. So there are issues about, there are green issues, there are urban-rural issues, there are foreign direct investment, etc. There are many issues that matter that are not comprehensively addressed, but I don't think that's a critique, because one cannot really, it's a never-ending story about what drives growth. So a couple of technical comments first, to be brief on this, is first is an issue about how to measure growth. And I mean, the ADB is surely aware that there is a long-standing discussion about measurements, and especially the purchasing power parity, how to adjust for price differences. And the kind of point that I will, is of course well known. You see from the curves here that in nominal terms, the growth of Asia is less spectacular, but in purchasing power parities, the share of Asia in world GDP rises much faster. And this is as it should be, and we trust the PPP data in a sense. But the measurement really matters, and it matters especially for Asia. So these are just some figures of a couple of years back. I didn't update them, but you have this old Madison data saying that that from 1990 to 2010, Asia rose from 27 to 40% of the world economy, where the nominal was 25 to 29, whereas you have the most recent World Bank data, 23 to 34. And and if you compare world regions, you will see that this impact of PPP is much greater for Asia than for Europe, for Americas, etc. So it's and if kind of growth is inflated in the past because of all the, the figures have been jumping a bit up and down from the World Bank counting of price differences. So if it's kind of high in the past, you will get a kind of problem in the future, in a sense. So yeah, so the measurement matters. Second technical comment is about growth accounting, where the conclusion is, in a sense, that extensive growth, where you kind of accumulate factors, becomes less important as countries grow more advanced, where TFP, total factor productivity growth, is dominating. So you run regressions about how much of growth is accounted for by a growth in the labor stock, in physical and human capital, and the residual is, in a sense, the TFP. So the question is if they can really be distinguished, as the report really thoroughly shows that and educational quality differs. So if you measure human capital by the educational attainment, the quality difference is important, and a lot of the human capital is actually obtained through learning. Even the quality of capital could vary by advanced and less advanced technology. So distinguishing factors from TFP should not kind of be exaggerated because they are kind of interlinked. And the second technical comment, which I will also comment on the kind of content of, is about that in the growth accounting framework, countries tend to grow alone. So you have country data and you see how this drive growth, but of course regions grow together. So your neighbor, the growth of your neighbor matters. So there is a need to take into account heterogeneity and geography. And this study doesn't, but I'm very sure that the ADO and ADB is fully aware of this, and you have studies on trade and international production networks, which increases even this mutual dependence and interactions between countries. So this is an old figure. So it's only 14 countries in Asia plus Australia and New Zealand to the left and European countries to the right. So if you had all the 45 here, you would have even more heterogeneity in the Asian spectrum. So of course the country heterogeneity in income levels matters, and this is reflected in factor endowments, human and physical capital, but also resource endowments, because you have a significant number of commodity reliant countries among the 45. So I will show a little calculation exercise to show this impact of geography and of commodity reliance for the growth in Asia, using a model I developed in my research recently, where you have, it should be 110 countries, regions and country groups, where the large countries such as China, India, Russia, Kazakhstan, Canada, USA, and Brazil are split into regions. Some countries aggregated into groups, especially in Africa. It covers 98% of the world economy in the numerical calculations. Has three sectors: raw materials, services, traded goods and services. Countries have natural resources, labor, and physical and human capital. And there is a matrix of trade costs between all these 110 countries. And I simulated with 2014 data, and it replicates world income levels and trade reasonably well. But it's still theory with numbers. So it's a kind of virtual reality which is close to the world, but not fully. So I show you a kind of stylized experiment that we shrink China to its 1990 level. So you have this model which is, we have a base scenario for 2014. And I said, how would the world be if China was shrinking to its 1990 level? So 24 years of growth in between. So this graph shows the welfare gain. So the model shows that other countries gain from China's growth. And of course, I have this for all the 110, including Norway and Americas, etc. So what you see from the graph here is that there are two countries that gain more than others. The typical gain is a percentage point in welfare per capita. So the ones gaining more are the commodity countries because of the terms of trade, impact of China especially, and those with proximity to China. So Russia East, Russia is in 12 regions, but they are aggregated to East and West. So you see East is more than West because of its proximity and the commodities. And India and Sri Lanka are lower because they are a bit further away and less commodity reliant. Norway, for example, would lose some of its manufacturing or the manufacturing share of GDP because of the terms of trade effect. So yes, so the point is that there is a heterogeneity and there is an interaction between countries which is important for the growth patterns. So of course, this matters for the analysis and space, and the terms of trade is important for all these commodity countries. So this interaction is part of this growth picture. So many other issues, as I said. inequality, domestic inequality is one theme about growth, which is not too much addressed. Inequality in education too, of course. Some are partly addressed, but as I say, we cannot address all issues every time, and I will be brief, so I'll not go into these issues. I would say that, I will mention that we actually have a project on ICT and development, where we have some work on India and some with global data. And Sigrid, who made her thesis, actually found the same result as you have in the ADO, that ICT matters more for the more advanced countries. So for the poorest, it was harder to measure the growth impact of ICT, especially the internet. So I hope to do work on OBOR, which is also a kind of connectivity project. I mean, how trade links and infrastructure affect growth, to use this model for study of this. So we need to know the costs and benefits, and it's relevant for this infrastructure part, which is also kind of a kind of interconnected or geographical or spatial component. Should have said more about Trump maybe, but because we are all worried about these signals about trade policy from Trump, I tried actually to make some simulation about his border tax, but I didn't have time enough to complete for today's event, so that will come later. But of course, the trade environment is important for growth and for Asia. In general, in the model I made, I split countries into regions, the large ones, because I think Luxembourg and China are kind of different, and you could find examples in the Pacific too. So in principle you should, but of course there are data limitations. I'm sure that's also underlying. But I think a good morale is that China is kind of diverse and heterogeneous. So that's an issue. So we hope to continue also cooperating with ADB. We had assistance from ADB in 3 years ago. We made a study on Asia for the ministry. There's other people here working with ADO. A lot of NUPI activity on Eurasia, Central Asia, so we hope to continue with this. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Melchior, for your insightful and to-the-point questions. Zhuang and Melchior, could we all join at the stage? And then I'm happy in the middle. I'm a middle income kind of guy, so I like to sit here. First, I think I should offer an opportunity to you to maybe respond shortly to some of Melchior's comments, if you're happy to do that. And following that, we'll be very happy to also take questions from our very enlightened and brilliant audience.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your very constructive comments. I think certainly the measurement of GDP, we are aware, of the issues, and the PPPs, yeah, certainly. Actually, we ADB actually our department was involved in producing the PPP estimates. ADB actually we are the regional coordinator for this global initiative. The last round was 2011, and but yeah, so we know all these issues, and certainly but our analysis, actually we make use when we classify country into middle income, high income, low income, we use the PPP data. So because the World Bank, of course, they have a classification based on the current US dollar, but the data only will not go back as early as 1960. So in order to do that, we have to, to match the World Bank later years. Of course, the World Bank data, but we use PPP so that we can go back as early as 1960. And so yeah, and that certainly. But overall, I think our conclusion will remain numbers, maybe, precise numbers. Again, this gross accounting, the measurement of TFP and production function, what you assume for instance, the labor income share and capital income share, all these matters for this TFP estimate. We experimented different assumptions, but overall we found that the results are robust. But again, you talk, the data, for instance, even quality of capital, quality of labor, so can be different countries, endowments. So that we basically have to assume that we use quite a standard neoclassical production function to the gross accounting gross decomposition. But that certainly the issues you raised, we're aware of that. And you mentioned about the other issues, income inequality issue certainly is important for growth. And actually 3 years ago or 4 years ago, we did a study. Actually, our book is there, the inequality in Asia and Pacific. So this is again the ADO, the same chapter, and we look at implications, drivers of income inequality and implications for growth, for poverty reduction. So we not include in this chapter, it's not means that we think it's not important, because the scope we have to limit, and the governance issue is also important. And 2 years ago, we did a study on the role of the governance in development. So yeah. And then certainly, you're talking about collaboration with ADB. We're certainly very much interested in continue our cooperation and in areas of common interest. Yeah, thank you.
Are you happy with that?
Yes, I'm very happy with the response. I think that, of course, growth is a never-ending theme, and but I'm very sure that ADB is aware of all this. So I didn't think that you was not aware of the PPP and the growth accounting things. So no, so surely. So it's but yes. So yes, I'm pleased.
Thank you.
Good. Then we'll keep discussing, and I will first ask if there are any questions amongst you to both Zhuang and Melchior. We'll also be happy to respond. I'll start with you, and there is a mic.
Okay, and that's working. My name is Asbjørn Løvbrekk. I had one question and perhaps a comment to the ADO, the forecasting. And then one question relating to the transition from middle income to high income. Now, on the forecasting, there is one thing that you could do, and I don't think you will do, because this is one deficiency with pretty much every international report put out by international agencies, where you look at the existing growth rates and then make forecasts for the future. So the Asian Development Bank is by no means the only one not doing this. But the question that would be fascinating to have documented in the reports is simply this one. This is our forecast. We report on 2016. We forecast for 2017 and 2018. What did we forecast 1 year ago? In other words, did you actually forecast 1 year ago the actual growth rates recorded now for 2016? Perhaps you get quite close on the average, but for the individual countries, I'm sure you would get quite different figures. I haven't got the 2016 with me, but let's just take as an illustration. I'm pretty sure that the forecast for the United States didn't say 1.6%. It probably said about 2.5, because that was the conventional wisdom a year ago. I'm pretty sure that the forecast for India didn't say 7.1%. I'm pretty sure it was pretty much higher, because the conventional wisdom inspired by the new Indian government was that growth rate in India would exceed 8%. Of course, you can go back to the previous year's exercise and do that comparison, but it's obviously much better for people's understanding of the issues if you get that right there in the update report. But again, you don't do it, the World Bank doesn't do it, just about any others don't do it. The IMF does it to some extent, because they often say our forecast this quarter is so much, that is down from either a quarter ago or a year ago. So that's the question relating to the forecasting and how you can improve reporting in terms of forecasting on economic growth rates. The question on the transition, I was especially if you take China as an example, I was missing out the analysis that relates to the transition from a purely production-based economy to a more consumption-based economy. That didn't factor in explicitly in what you were presenting. And the second element there would be the world is changing quite rapidly. So if you like, the catching up goes much more quickly. So if you look at the measurements of transition themes 2, 3, 4, 5 decades ago, you could look at how many more people were getting electricity, how many more people were getting cars, etc., different consumption items. If you look at the penetration rate for internet, it's so much more dramatically quickly in those middle-income countries
we
in
have
Asia.
to get more
So
questions. So
does it
speed
make
it up a bit?
No, that's the final point.
All right, great.
Does it make a difference in terms of the rapidity of technological change, in particular internet access, other ICT issues? Will that mean something qualitatively different from the kind of transitions from middle-income countries to high-income countries now compared with 3 decades ago?
I think you respond to those questions right away.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you for very interesting questions and important question. First, on growth projection, actually we came up actually a growth projection 4 times a year, so every quarter. And every time we have a new projection, we say, the growth, for instance, for India, we reduced this quarter, of course, for 2016 and 2017 or whatever years, from previous projections. So we have 4 times a year quarterly projections for region as a whole, and for major economies, actually 2 times for all the countries, and another 2 times for major economies. So total basically 4 times. We have an AD outlook and update and 2 supplements. So in that sense, and of course I understand growth projection forecasts always, it's not an easy business, So we do have internal models, but the models mainly used for making sure that the consistency, of overall. And so we just use the model to come up with numbers. We come up with numbers, but we also have to exercise our judgment. And so overall, actually, we looked at our growth performance, for projection performance. We looked at how accurate our growth projections in the past. Actually, we looked, our performance is not that bad, in terms of compared to competitors. It's not bad, actually. So we are very pleased about that. Now, the transition to high-income country, I agree that we look at them more on the supply side, and basically human capital, innovation, and infrastructure, all a supply side. So we did not look at the consumption, as I mentioned, and because this is also one of the ways we can do kind of exercise. And transition, and you mentioned about transition from middle to high. 30 or 40 years ago compared to now will be different. I 100% agree. So, but we are arguing that whatever with the other things, of course, is innovation, the human capital infrastructure is really important things. We need to look into that. Thank you.
Mercury, you have a short response to the same
Yeah, it's kind of related, but indirectly. But I would like to say a few words about Mr. Trump, because in the ADO, of course, it was mentioned that the signals, policy signals from some Western quarters were kind of importance for future growth. And of course, Brexit and Trump were kind of earthquakes in trade policy and economics. And I think that the Brexiteers, they are free traders. They want to make agreements with China and Asia, etc. But of course, Mr. Trump has come with protectionist signals. And if you read, for example, some of the books of this Peter Navarro, who is heading this Trade Policy Council of the White House, it's kind of a bit shocking. It states that USA is already in a trade war with China. A lot of China's competitiveness is not due to kind of sound competitive strengths like the labor, but it's due to kind of currency undervaluation, cheating on IPR, etc. So this is kind of stark reading. Mr. Navarro also says that a military conflict is possible. So trade policy could even be used to limit China's ability to build strength. So, yeah, so these books are kind of stark reading, but of course now in the USA there are kind of fierce debates, and this policy is still in the making. So I think that's so it's of course important for the world economy and for Asia, and we must hope for the best when it comes to the final shape of these trade policies. And Mr. Trump has made world economics and politics also a bit of a TV show. So, for example, on TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is an agreement between 5 American, 5 Asian, and Australia and New Zealand countries, it is actually some of the traits of the TPP is actually taking into account IPR and aspects which are supported by the Trump proponents in the USA. So then it was quite surprising that this is denounced as a rape of the country, as was said in the election campaign, and that this was cancelled from the start. So this was a bit surprising, but we'll see what happens next.
The fierce debates in the USA, we'll try to keep it a bit more pleasant here, but we'll see what happens. I think you had your... Or to the, yeah, in the back.
Hi, my name is Fanala. I'm a PhD student in economics at the University of California at Berkeley, and I'm visiting NUPI this academic year. And I was wondering, my question was mainly about energy policy and how that would relate to the Asian development outlook. So I remember reading an article in the past where Professor Zhang Jinwei mentioned that when the fact that oil prices have been low is an opportune time for countries to implement energy reforms. In particular, for instance, fuel subsidies, and I wondered how that policy view would change with respect to the development outlook that you discussed today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, on the energy policy and energy reforms, as you rightly said, the last few years, low oil prices provide a good opportunity for many Asian countries to implement fuel subsidy reforms. Indonesia, for instance, in India, many other countries as well. So I think certainly in the sense implication to outlook, because of lower subsidy, that means government, the fiscal, the budget can use for something else. For instance, the previously paying fuel subsidy, now you don't pay, and then for education, for infrastructure investment. This is what happened in Indonesia, for instance, in other countries as well. Certainly that has implications for growth outlook. And but I think overall, the regional government, the countries are very committed. They know that the subsidies benefits, basically general subsidies benefit everyone, and if actually benefit the rich more than the poor. So actually we found that general energy subsidy, actually the increase in inequality increase in rather than reduce it. So many countries are aware of that, and then the reduce subsidy and to adopt a more targeted subsidy, target on the poor, the needy, the people need the government support. So this is what happened, again, in Indonesia. So we're very much positive about the commitment of regional governments in continuing this move towards targeted intervention away from general subsidies.
No? We've said we've tried to finish around 2:30, but that leaves us room for a few more questions.
My name is Eivind Hoffman. I'm a labor economist and statistician, formerly with the ILO in Geneva. And my question relates to the long-term development challenges that you see emerging from the increasing demographic imbalances in many of the high and middle-income countries in the region, both with respect to age structure and with respect to sex ratios, and the consequences that this may have on migration patterns within the region, but also the extent to which this may generate a competition for the highly skilled workers, not only in the region, but also in countries like the European countries, and in addition to the competition which are already there from the traditional immigration countries like the US and Australia and Canada. Thank you.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. So demographic transition, population aging certainly are the issues facing some of the economies in Asia, especially Singapore, Korea, of course, Japan, of course, has been there for a long time, the issue, and China now increasingly. China, as I mentioned earlier, working age population started declining from 2011. And so East Asia actually is typical, the challenge for East Asia. But in 2015, the aging population is 15% already, and then will continue to grow. So I think because this is a challenge, and you also mentioned about the balance of a sex ratio, in some of the countries in Asia, some preference still there. And so some are economic issues, some are culture related. So we need education. And for population aging, in the case of China, for instance, now the government allowed two-child, right? So that the policy adopted. But empirical evidence show that actually not, especially in urban area, not many couples want to have a second child, even if you allow that. But there are other ways. For instance, you can increase the retirement age. This is China is doing, and then many European countries, of course, you have a much higher retirement age. And so I think this is certainly a challenge, and the response, of course, is more education. The investment in education, lifetime learning, and social protection strengthening. So these are the broadly standard anyway. When we discuss that kind of issue, we always come up with this kind of policy recommendations. But of course, the situation differs from country to country. And you mentioned about skill, the competition for skills. But the labor mobility is still quite limited, right? In Asia, for instance, among Asian countries, ASEAN is under the ASEAN country under ASEAN Economic Community. They have the one of the target is to fully mobility of skilled labor, but it's not yet achieved yet. Basically, the issue of how to mutually recognize the skill qualifications. So skill mutual recognition is the issue. So ADB is supporting that actually to help the capacity building among the ASEAN countries to facilitate that. So I think overall, I very much agree with you. The challenge will population aging and demographic transition impact on the quality of labor force, as well as increase the fiscal burden of the government. And so basically the country will have to take early actions. Even for countries, now still have young population, but population growth will be lower, much lower in the US, in India, for instance, in Philippines even. So much lower, and then the education, the investing in human capital, so that is important, and taking early actions, and maximize the benefits of still demographic dividend. Some countries still enjoy.
Thank you. Melchior, do you have a few sharp points you want to
I just want
add
to
to
say,
that?
well, I think when we made this Asia study, and ADB was, I think at that time when you made this book on demographics of Asia, so there is a book on this demographic
That's
issues.
a book there.
Yeah, so I think it's an issue is that demographics and gender issues are kind of important interacting for creating the labor force. So I think some countries in Asia still have a great demographic dividend, like India, for example. You have relatively low labor force participation, so they have a kind of potential growth dividend, while other countries have less to gain or have kind of spent their potential and have welfare issues, which are quite also important for the growth prospects. I mean, life in Singapore for the elderly is an issue in spite of its high income level. So that has an impact on growth with this demographic profile.
All right, is there a final burning question? There are two actually. Are they both, if you keep them very short, we have time for both of them.
Hi, Jonas, I'm with the Central Bank. Very quick, how do you look how do you see the change in the risk of a too high of a debt build-up in China? How has it changed in the last, say, year?
Yeah. Okay. So the high level of corporate debt is one of the issues we often highlight in our report, in previous reports as well. And but I think of course the level remain high, right? But on the other hand, the good news is the government is aware of that, is taking actions. And for instance, the government introduced the measure of debt equity swap. So and set up. Of course, China has a quite a very good number of asset management companies, take over the non-performing loans. So I think overall is an issue, but we believe that it's still manageable. But in a sense, have to take basically very cautious, basically to be careful and to monitor the situation closely and continue the measures government has introduced, and overall we think is an issue, but the government is taking, and we believe that's still manageable.
Yeah. Ola, the final question.
Thank you. Uli Kjennerud, DNB Markets. External debt in many emerging markets are at record highs, measured in absolute terms, dollar. Are there particular Asian countries that are more vulnerable because they have a large share of short-term external debt now that the Fed is about to normalize monetary policy?
No, actually, as I mentioned earlier, for developing Asia, the external payment position much better now compared to 20 years ago, or compared to even 3 years ago when the 2013 the Fed signaled the monetary tightening. And if you look at the data, external debt as percent of GDP is quite low. I don't think of course a few countries, it's very, some countries are high, but of course that they have a large amount of official development assistance flowing. So I think overall, I certainly don't want to say which country is more vulnerable than others. Yeah, but overall, what I can say is that situation much the overall situation is much better now than compared to many years ago, and the overall debt level, external debt level, as a percent of GDP is low. It's not high now. But of course, I mean, there are some companies, for instance, because of low interest rates, accumulate high level of debt. Some individual companies, so that needs to be watched carefully. So the thing is, the issue is, we should avoid the individual companies getting and then lead to systemic risks, right? So that is needs. I think the government is aware. Governments are aware of that issue, and then in terms of regulation and supervision framework is much stronger. So we believe that certainly the issue and the risk, but again, as I mentioned earlier, the manageable.
And a couple of final words from you, Melchior.
2 words. It's that when I read the report, I also picked from my bookshelf The Asian Miracle, the book from 1993 from the World Bank, which was a kind of hit at the time, and I tried to see what are the differences. And of course, one difference is the focus of the ADB, which is much more comprehensive, because we were aware of the emerging nations growing fast, but the ADB has a focus on 45 countries, Central Asia to Pacific, etc., to and all Asia. So this, I think, is important with this awareness of this great heterogeneity of Asia. And I think the report also says that there is statistically convergence. So even if we have to hope for the emerging nations escaping from the middle income trap, it's also important to have the tail included, and you have overall convergence in the region. So I think ADB makes a useful contribution also by having this comprehensive focus on the region, and we should learn about all of that.
All right, I have a few burning questions myself, which I'm not going to bother you with now, but leave for later. Zhuang, thank you so much for taking the time to come by and present this year's report.
Thank you.
Looking better than ever, maybe this year's report, I think. Very, very insightful.
Yep. Right, yeah.
And also thank you to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for sharing this event together with us. And thank you to all of you for coming here, and in particular those of you asking questions. Wish you all very well, and wish to see you again here soon for more hot stuff on Asia at the Institute of International Affairs. So we wave a goodbye to the streaming camera and then wish you all a well out. There's still sunshine, so almost sunshine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.